And in that spirit, I wanted to ask you, Kyle, why were you drawn to make such a personalized work that goes beyond the statistics and into the heart of the matter of mass incarceration with Untitled America?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thank all of you for the work that you do. Everything that you all do really inspires what I hope to create. Making a work like Untitled America was one of those things where I knew the reach of Ailey, and I know the power of art and the performing arts. And what I really wanted to do in making that work was to really get to the heart of the humanity of the subject matter. But everyone has some relationship with the idea and ideals of family and isolation. So I wanted to focus much more on the commonalities of those subject matters to get to the heart of anyone's experience, either dealing with incarceration, mass incarceration, or with the kind of unjust ways in which we can be separated or be set in this kind of cyclical nature of newfound slavery. All of these things were something that I felt like most audience members could connect with in some way, shape, or form. Just trying to kind of address that humanity and address these maybe these different points of entry for people, for audiences who may feel in some ways disconnected, to make them feel that much more an honest and organic connection.
And that's what's, to me, again, powerful about art in Untitled America. What I love about that piece is that it gives voice in a first-person way to all of these voiceless millions. When you put people in jails and prisons, it's not just them, it's their families. There are over 100 million people in this country have family members in jails and prisons. And for a generation, we were led by politicians preaching fear and anger who told us that you are what you do. And we created these sentences like we were putting crimes in prison. But you don't put crimes in prison, you put people in prison. And when we tell stories and we express the humanity of those people in prison, we start to think differently about whether it's right to condemn somebody to life imprisonment without parole for writing a bad check. And that truth-telling is the very kind of truth-telling that I think we need to experience in this country.
Bryan, I love this, that you say that truth and justice are sequential, that truth and reconciliation are sequential. You say that before we can attain justice and reconciliation, that we must start with the truth of who we are as a country. Do you think this year has put us any closer to telling the truth of who we are as a country?
I do. I think a lot of people have bought into this idea that we can just, at some point, free ourselves from the legacy of racial inequality and racial injustice, that these toxins that have corrupted and polluted our environment for so long, at some point will just dissipate by themselves. And I think what we now realize, what more people realize, is that the kind of toxins we are dealing with, the kind of lies, the kind of poison, the kind of bigotry that we are dealing with will not dissipate on its own. We're going to actually have to clean the environment. And the truth that there is work we must do to correct this history, to confront this history of racial injustice, I think has been made clearer, because here we are in 2020, and we see the same lethal use of violence against Black people just because they're Black that we've seen for nearly 400 years. And I think that optic has caused a lot of people to kind of revisit these things. And people should have known all along, you cannot survive a genocide. I think we're a post-genocide country. I think what we did to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of indigenous people through famine and war and disease, and we never really acknowledged that. You can't enslave Black people for 2.5 centuries, bring millions of Black people in chains and enslave them and abuse them and humiliate them, and then worse, create a narrative about Blackness. And I've argued that the great evil of slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude. It was this narrative we created that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less deserving, less capable, less human, less valuable, less worthy. And that narrative, which we've never acknowledged, that ideology of white supremacy that narrative created, we never really acknowledged. And so we have the Civil War, and the North wins the Civil War, but the South wins the narrative war. And that idea persists. And then and we don't acknowledge it. And then we have a century of mob violence directed at Black people, lynchings, where Black people were pulled out of their homes and beaten and tormented and tortured and killed, sometimes on the courthouse lawn, and we've never acknowledged it. And then we have this civil rights movement where Black people give their lives trying to push this country to own up to its values. And in my community, in Montgomery, Alabama, people would put on their Sunday best and they'd go places where they knew they'd get beaten and bloodied and battered, but they went anywhere. It was amazingly courageous and committed. And yet, we never embraced the idea of racial inequality. The states that said, we don't want you to vote, we don't want you to go to school, never said, we're sorry, never said, we're going to fix that. They were forced into these places. And so now we see this manifestation. And so I do think the reality of 2020 has made it easier for those of us who are doing this work to convince others we've got work to do. We are going to have to commit to truth telling. We're going to need truth and justice, truth and restoration, truth and reconciliation, truth and reparation, truth and redemption. And in every faith tradition in the world, we create spaces where people are invited to acknowledge the ways they have failed, not because their failure will condemn them, but because that acknowledgement means that we can transition to something better. And that's what I think this country has to do. We have to acknowledge the ways in which we have failed to create safe spaces for Black and poor people, that we have failed to overcome the legacy of slavery and lynching and segregation, that we have failed to deal seriously with the obligations of justice. And when we do that, that's when all the beautiful stuff starts to happen. And that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm eager to see.